Hello, everyone, and hi, Jake. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and thanks, for your availability. We have known each other for a few years now, and I've been following your blog and your content. It's really amazing topics. So for
Thank you.
those who don't know you, so Jake is a senior solution architect. He has been building architectures for more than 10 years now, 10, 12 years now at large scales. You are Microsoft MVP as well. And yeah, maybe I'll let you complete some of the information. I know that you are really strong on the network and the enterprise scale, but yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for having me. Yeah, great to be here and talking about a particular technology I'm quite fond of. But yeah, I've been working in Azure sort of full time for over about 5 years now, doing lots of things, infrastructure as code, lots of the networking side, and just really enjoy kind of these sessions where we go through things and help people learn and share some resources. So yeah, hope this is useful to everybody watching, and yeah, just thank you for having me again.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, today we'll be talking about Azure networking. So the goal here is really to go deep into Azure networking and the different topics we hear about: the virtual WAN, hub and spoke, why one and not the others. What are the options there, and especially for those who are building, you mentioned infrastructure as code and Terraform and so on, like how we can go deep. So let's maybe start with first thing first, about the Azure networking itself, like as a basic form. What can you tell me as an engineer when I get started on the networking in Azure?
I think probably the biggest thing is there are some quite key differences to the more traditional plugging in cables and things like that from a network perspective. So that networking in Azure is software defined networking, and there are a number of different conventions and different ways of working that we just need to be aware of. They're not things that are out to trip us up or that sort of stuff by any means, but they're just certain conventions that we would need to be aware of. People have probably seen examples where they've migrated a VM to Azure or set the network interface to a static IP, for example. There's a really basic difference. You don't do that on the VM, you do that in the Azure portal. So there's a few things like that where there are just some subtleties to be aware of. But what's really interesting about the networking in Azure is it's all integrated into obviously the Azure platform, so we can manage that in the portal. We can do that in code. We can start to work with the networking in perhaps ways that pre-hyperscalers weren't an option to us or were more challenging to implement. So perhaps the biggest thing for me is some of the infrastructure as code aspects, some of the ways that I can do. One of the examples I've used before is subnet calculation in Terraform. That's a relatively new thing. It's certainly not something I'd done before, but that's a really good example of some of those things that come with that cloud networking piece.
Yeah, and so especially for those who are used maybe to the networking on the on-prem, and so the migration to the cloud it's completely different paradigm, and it's completely different maybe even mindset of how to do the networking.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
I think it's sorry, go on.
Yeah, so go ahead. Yeah.
No, and it's just you're exactly right. It's just understanding some of those changes, understanding some of those conventions, and once they're understood, it's quite surprising how quickly people from perhaps a non-networking background can actually start to pick up some of those aspects. I myself don't come from a networking background. I was kind of an infrastructure generalist, and I actually specialized in Citrix for a long time. But by virtue of working more in Azure and understanding some of the needs of large organizations with a global footprint, I've had to kind of learn some of that networking and go on that journey, and that's been really interesting seeing that from a cloud perspective.
Yeah, and so this is also what brings us to the topic of how you implement the network at the enterprise scale, what makes sense, and how you can start with just simple components into a hub and spoke and virtual WAN and so on. So maybe one naive question that I have in mind, when I start the networking, is why do I need, for example, if I talk about the hub and spoke, and everyone is talking about the hub and spoke, why I need a hub and spoke? like, can I put everything in the same VNet and just call it a day?
So interesting. Yes. So you actually could put everything in one VNet, but I think it would get very unmanageable very, very quickly. and one of the reasons we wouldn't go down that route, for example, is we would start to lose the ability to separate things out. So that again has an impact on things like security. It has an impact on things like management. Also, I think it's really important to think of it from a sanity perspective. We need manageable chunks of infrastructure that sit logically and piece together logically, and actually separating our resources allows us to do that. So that kind of hub and spoke model allows us to centralize shared services, shared connections, shared resources in the hub, and then connect our spokes into it. So a typical example might be we have multiple spokes where we're hosting our services, but we need those to communicate with another site or an office or another hub. And actually we might deploy a gateway, or we might do a peering or something like that within that hub to facilitate that. So it's partly about making it neat and organized, but also by virtue of doing that, it means we can have that control, we can have that security, and build that out in a way that's manageable for us.
Okay, I see. And so in this case, like, why or how the V1 like plays in this configuration? So, okay, the hub and spoke, like starting for a simple network, and we need segmentation and we need to make it work. So why we need to switch now into V1? And maybe what is V1 like as a...
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So the Virtual WAN offering effectively brings lots of different Azure services into a single point of control, and that's always how I talk about Virtual WAN to customers. Actually the service it's giving you and the services it enables are available on their own. Deploying gateways, deploying firewalls, creating peerings, but actually Virtual WAN brings all of that into a single interface. So probably the most important key aspect there is Virtual WAN allows you to use Microsoft's network for your traffic. So for example, if I'm connecting Office A or Site A to Office B or Site B, I don't need to just put perhaps an IPsec tunnel or something between them. I can actually connect to my nearest Microsoft gateway point of presence as I've got other resources deployed, and connect over Microsoft's network to enable that. So that's very, very powerful for those organizations that perhaps are reliant on long global connections over the public internet, for example. And actually being able to utilize Microsoft's network and their private connectivity is really quite a powerful change.
Okay. And so like I was building, we work with a lot of customers, and also we have like a lot of Azure customers that are building networking, and we see different topologies. So I was the last time, like I had a template of the topology, and I was like wondering, okay, let me bring it here. Let's say, for example, this is like my networking example in the simplest basic form. So we have like two regions here. I have East US and I have West US, and like I found myself going from the simple way of putting the networking together, like VNet, subnet routing, and so on, into the interconnectivity between the two regions, and also not just connectivity between the two regions, but also different setup configuration and different resources that I didn't use before, like the hub. So why I do need the hub and so on. Help me understand like how it works.
Yeah, so essentially when you deploy Virtual WAN, you receive or you deploy a hub in each region of your choosing. And that's also an interesting point, because that ties in very nicely to your ability to expand as well. So you've got two regions as an example on this diagram, and that could be, for example, to service your users in both of those locations. But actually, by having a hub in both of those regions, you're enabling that communication to take place. So that gives you that routing unit. Think of that like a virtual router. By having that in place in both of those regions, you can then start to bring in other services as well. So I can see you've got a firewall deployed over in the East US region there. Again, that's another really powerful feature, because you can centralize that control and have firewalls deployed next to your hubs in all of your regions, but manage them centrally through Firewall Manager. So again, it's all about that scaling out and that ability to grow quickly and to make those changes across your topology as you would need.
So as I understand, like I have my VNet, every VNet into a different region, and the goal is to make them talk to each other, right?
Correct.
And so this is where I need like the hub to be able to connect my hub to the VNet, and then the hubs connect to each other. Is that a correct assumption?
They do. So within in a typical configuration, you would have a virtual WAN hub in all of the regions that you need to operate in. You would then connect your VNets in through a peering to that hub in each region. So those spokes are automatically enabled for communication. So if you think of spoke A in region 1 would be able to communicate to spoke B in region 2. That's automatically enabled by virtual WAN. It manages that routing for you. And for those who've used hub and spoke and probably had to work out some of the route tables and manage that themselves, that's a really nice change because it brings that into central management for you and actually automates that. So as you add other spokes, the communication is enabled automatically by virtual WAN managing those routing tables for you. Now, for anybody listening who's thinking of that from a security perspective, they're probably thinking, wow, that sounds exactly what we don't want, because we don't want everything to automatically be able to talk. So it's really important just to call out that you do have options to control that. So you can put firewalling in. Obviously, you can start to use NSGs if you wish. You know, there's quite a few options there in Azure. But actually, what's really important about that is, let's say, you know, imagine this was a business and that business started out with a number of spokes and 2 regions where they had hubs deployed, and things are going really well. The business decides to expand. You could say, actually, I may have 2 regions deployed in the US, but I'm going to open an office in Europe somewhere, and you may spin up a European region. Now, in a typical configuration, that would require quite a lot of thought. How do we deploy that? What are our routes going to be? How do we think about IP ranges? With virtual WAN, you would deploy another hub, give that hub a range, and automatically that routing would be enabled for you. So that expansion piece is really, really key to this, and just being able to grow quickly and have that managed automatically for you from a routing perspective, you know, from a firewalling perspective, by being able to deploy firewall, perhaps using an existing rule set as well. That's a really key point for virtual WAN.
Yeah, doing the devil's advocate here, like I hear when you talk about the V1 that are a lot of automation and configuration that is made out of the box. How deep can I go into these default configuration and change them the way I want, versus what I'm used to do with hub and spoke, where every piece of the network, I design it myself and I run it myself?
So I think it's worth calling out that virtual WAN has been on a journey over the last few years. There's been a lot of enhancements and improvements brought to it. As far as I'm aware, there's nothing significant that you can't manage as you would be used to with hub and spoke. So, for example, being able to override routes, put custom routes in, you know, being able to bring in things like express route, site to site or point to site, all of that is part of virtual WAN. So I'm not aware of anything that perhaps would be a blocker in that scenario.
Okay. And so, and back to the, to this configuration, to my architecture, I understand that the communication will go through the hub, and the hubs talks to each other. So if I create a new spoke, it's going to be the same configuration as having like VNet, where you have all the network plus the hub that will connect to the rest of it.
Exactly that. Yep.
What are all the resources that I may need, for example?
So on this diagram, you can see you've got I think there's a couple of public IPs to service gateway. I think the express route gateway is shown. So that could be an express route gateway. It could be a virtual network gateway for IPsec or you know, site to site, or it could be for point to site. So the typical sort of supporting resources would still exist. You will still have gateways. You will still have public IPs. You will still have firewalls. You'll still see peerings when you look at the network. But the difference here is they are all managed by that virtual WAN instance. So it's very much a case of, rather than having discrete individual resources that you kind of manage and put together, virtual WAN sort of wraps all that up for you in its own control layer. So again, that's really nice from a standardization perspective, from a deployment perspective, and yeah, I think from sort of my experience, that's also really nice from an infrastructure as code perspective. You know, being able to bring that into a you know, a repository, perhaps into a pipeline where you're using that for deployment, and again, centralizing all of that management is you know, is really rather useful.
Yeah, and this is since you talked about the management and and infrastructure as code, as an engineer that managed infrastructure, the first thing I think about is like, what are the components that I really need versus the components that are optional, and the components that I don't need. So
Yeah.
if you help me understand, like see through it, what is mandatory for my V1 to work, what is optional, and what is, and maybe later also we talk about the cost, because the last time we were speaking together, you mentioned the cost as well is not obvious to everyone. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a really important point around. I've seen virtual WAN deployed, for example, in environments where there's perhaps only one or two regions with no utilization of perhaps site-to-site connectivity over the virtual WAN, or no utilization of perhaps plans to expand or something like that. And actually, in those scenarios, there is an argument to suggest perhaps you're not seeing the full benefit of it, and actually a standard hub and spoke topology, with gateways deployed as appropriate, would give you the same thing, and actually, would result in a less cost for you. So there's always that kind of balance of making sure it's the right fit for the right solution. But I think, to your point around what's deployed by default, so there are two SKUs for virtual WAN. There's a most basic format, which, being honest, I tend to see used mostly for sort of testing and development. It has a slightly more limited feature set. It's all listed on the documents page, and there's the standard offering. So the standard offering includes all of the features that you might wish to deploy in an enterprise environment. So things like express route, things like firewalling, all the site-to-site connectivity. So standard does tend to be what's deployed, but out of the box, it will deploy virtual WAN in the region or regions of your choosing, and it will deploy a hub, and that's the most basic form, and that hub enables that spoke to spoke connectivity, and then it also sets you up for bringing on other regions and allowing them to communicate. So that would be the most basic form.
All right. And so I ask a maybe naive question, or someone who is just starting on the networking on Azure. So in this case, why do I need, for example, a public IP in this case? If I'm able to have the communication site to site managed by Microsoft, by Azure.
So in this example, that public IP will be servicing one of those external connections. So I think on that diagram you've got an express route gateway. So I'm on quite a small screen. So
yeah.
Yes. So it'll be servicing that, or I think that's also providing point to site from the naming. So that will be a public IP used by that gateway. So out of the box, I don't believe it would give you that. But if you've deployed, for example, point to site connectivity, it will go and spin those resources up for you, so that you've got that configuration available.
Okay, so the default configuration out of the box is I have the VNets and I have the hub plus the V1, right?
Yeah, so the V1 is just a control entity that resources sit under, and by default you would just have that single hub in the region of your choosing. Yeah, so that's also really nice, because I think sometimes there can be a sort of belief that virtual WAN is you deploy it and there's hundreds of resources or something like that with a very high cost, but it doesn't have to be like that. You can start small and then keep expanding as you need.
Yeah, so this is like I had two questions, especially when you said you keep expanding. So the scale, we will talk about the scale and what does it look like, and how it is, what does it mean as well to scale. But so here, the connectivity that I have, so here I have all the hubs that will connect to the V1. And I see here I have the offsite. When I check this resource here, this is like the Terraform resource. And we will talk about IAC later. This is the VPN site. So is this mandatory? Do I need a VPN site for the V1 to work?
No, you don't. You don't have to have that. So you would only need to bring that in if you had a remote location that you wanted to connect into that topology. So that could be, for example, an office location, or perhaps you're using this to connect to your customers, as an example. So that would be the same. Just as an example, if perhaps you had hub and spoke and you wanted to do a tunnel to one of your offices or to connect to somewhere else, something like that. So by default, you wouldn't have that. You would only bring that in and enable that on a case by case as you needed it basis.
All right. And so, and these just to make sure, because one of the users, one of the listeners asked the question about the costs. We will get to the question, but like naturally, it for me is like the question is, do I need to deploy all these resources in every region, or it's just in what we call it the main region where you have the V1?
Correct. So you don't need to deploy them in all the regions. As you expand the topology out, you would need to deploy a hub in the region, but then the supporting services can be brought in as you require. So for example, you might say that the East US region is where we've got our head office. That's our primary location, and just down the road is a building where 1,000 staff members work. You might want to go down the express route option in that region. And then you might say, actually, in the UK South region, we have a small office with 20 people in it, and we just want an IPsec tunnel into the nearest hub there. You don't have to have all of the same options in each region. You will have the routing units in each region, which allows all of that communication to take place. But things like gateways and those external services that support the topology, those can be deployed as you need on a per region basis. So it's very flexible from that front. And I think just on the cost perspective as well, that's really important, because actually what that's enabling is it's giving you that routing, it's giving you that standard topology where you can bring in things like walling, but also what it's doing is then enabling you to bring in those supporting services, so gateways, dial-in, express routes, site-to-site, all of that sort of stuff on a per region basis as you need.
I see. Okay. And we have one of the listeners asked, like, an organization has an existing on-prem one and wants to connect to Azure at minimum cost. Which connectivity solution should be used and why? I think.
Oh, that's an interesting one.
Yeah.
So that's one of those scenarios where you could go down a number of different routes. So that might be that you actually have an existing, let's say, SD-WAN topology that's got a number of sites on it, and you could choose for perhaps one strategic site that was perhaps HQ or something like that to have connectivity into Azure, and you could utilize your SD-WAN to send that traffic through that site up into Azure. That would be a simple and fairly cost-effective way to do it. And you just need to think about the amount of traffic in that scenario. You know, is that a critical service you're accessing? Do you really want it all going through just the one site? You know, what's the bandwidth requirement? So there's a little bit of sort of, you know, requirements capturing and scoping that would need to happen there. Also, you might want to look at that SD-WAN solution. So some SD-WAN providers also have offerings that can be deployed into Azure. So you may actually put an appliance into Azure as an NVA that you then connect into that topology, and it becomes almost like a node on your SD-WAN topology at that point. So there's a few different ways you could do that, all the way from a simple IPsec tunnel through to adding an SD-WAN node to Azure, all the way to putting express route with a multiple connections for resiliency. It's a bit of a sliding scale, but from a cost-effective standpoint, just a simple VPN tunnel or adding an SD-WAN node is probably going to be the cheapest option. But again, lots of variation on that due to use case.
All right. And so, and when we talk about the scale, like, it's clear now that I have the V1, which is, as explained, you have the main one, which is, we compare it to the hub, maybe in the hub and spoke topology, or it's not a good comparison?
No, it does compare to the hub, because again, that kind of hub VNet would be where you would centralize a lot of those key connectivity resources. And again, it's the same with Virtual WAN. It brings lots of those resources into that hub. So yeah, there are a lot of parallels to be drawn.
Okay, and then I have the secondary, the secondary regions, and how I scale. Let's say, for example, especially when the regions start to get complex, it's not like just I have networking, but I have specific things where maybe one of the regions will be connected to the on-prem, other region, maybe I have some security workload that I need to protect. So what do you see from the scaling aspect of it?
So I think it's an interesting question, because I don't think there's a single answer I could give you on that. I think there will be some variance by use case, but I think what I would say is for organizations that need to scale and centralize that control, having something like virtual WAN with a service like Azure Firewall or a third-party NVA deployed will give you two things. One, it will give you the setup that you need to scale, so you can expand to other regions as you need to, but also it puts a control resource in that from a security perspective. So we have a firewall or an NVA controlling our traffic through that topology. By having those two in place, as you need to expand, you can do by deploying virtual WAN into additional regions, by deploying that firewalling into additional regions. But what it also means is as scenarios come up, so take the US head office and the UK satellite office example that I used earlier. Again, that type of scenario would be easily enabled by having that topology. You could expand to another region. You know, for a small office, you could put a smaller IPsec tunnel or something like that in. For a large office, it could be express route. One of the other interesting scenarios that I've seen deployed in virtual WAN is the ability to have point to site. So to have a standardized point to site configuration where people dial into the closest region that it's deployed into. So again, it enables lots of that connectivity to happen relatively easily.
Okay, and yeah, and talking about the scaling and the different scenarios, also I cannot not think about the costs. So the costs of both running, like the cost of the topologies between hub and spoke versus V1, and the cost of the components in every architecture. So if you can help us like understand what are the key differences between the hub and spoke and the V1, technical details, but also in terms of pricing, where we should pay attention to.
Yeah, of course. So the biggest difference is, and I think it's just kind of prior to that, it's worth calling out that the cost for those supporting resources, so the cost for adding in a virtual network gateway or a public IP, or you know, the costs for bringing in Azure Firewall or something like that, those don't really change between virtual WAN and hub and spoke. If you decide to spin up an additional gateway, that gateway cost is largely you know, the same as it would be if you deployed in hub and spoke, depending on your routing configuration. Where there is a difference in virtual WAN is the cost of the routing unit. So that routing unit is a piece of compute behind the scenes. It's Microsoft managed, but that obviously incurs a cost because it's doing processing for you. So that ties nicely back into, I think, the example I referred to earlier, where if you're only one site, one region, or perhaps two regions, and you have no need to expand, perhaps virtual WAN is not the right solution for you, because you would pay an overhead for those routing units. There would be an additional cost, and you're not likely to see the benefit of that. Likewise, if you're not going to perhaps have offices communicating over that topology, again, I would question as to whether that's perhaps the right deployment for you. That's not to say that it's not that it's the wrong deployment. It will still work, but obviously in you know, in the age of FinOps and the age of making sure everything is as optimal as it can be, it's really important just to, you know, ask the question, is this the right solution for our particular use case?
Okay, yeah, and back again into the main differences between the V1 and the hub and spoke. Have you seen some organization that adopted one model and then switched to the other, then back to the switching between both models?
So I've only seen organizations go from hub and spoke to virtual WAN.
Okay.
Adopting it because, you know, their needs have changed and there's been a requirement to have more control, perhaps automated routing, that sort of stuff. Microsoft do have guidance as well over on Microsoft Learn for going from hub and spoke to virtual WAN. There's an actual like a guide that details the type of process you would follow, but essentially the process is you will stand them up side by side for a short period of time. It's always a difficult one because usually it requires carving out of additional address space. You know, there's a swap over of connectivity, there's a breaking of certain peerings and re-adding those peerings. So like any major networking change, particularly if it's part of your core network, there are going to be some hurdles to overcome and some things that will need to be carefully planned out. But the guidance is really useful. What's also very helpful is the ability to do testing. So to go off and perhaps deploy a basic SKU virtual WAN that just allows site-to-site connectivity and get familiar with it. You know, try it out, connect a couple of sites, have a separate IP space, do some testing, that sort of, you know, that kind of basic testing, but proving the concept, again, really useful and something that's quite quite easy for organizations to do.
And from the application point of view, let's say like I put my hat as a developer right in the application. I asked my team to give me like a infrastructure to provision, to create my, to deploy my infrastructure. What does it mean for me? Should I care about it or not at all? Is there any difference between V1 and hub and spoke?
From a developer perspective, I don't think it would make a huge amount of difference. So the kind of hub and spoke and virtual WAN would normally be provided by perhaps kind of core infrastructure or core networking teams. And as a developer, you might be given a particular VNet that sits in a spoke, and you may say, I need it to communicate with these services. Can you open these firewall rules? But actually, there isn't a huge amount of change in doing that. You know, you'd be given access to the resources you need. It would be easy and also easier for the network team in a large organization to make those changes because of the centralization of those services. So you might say, I have 10 spokes that I need creating in all 10 of the regions we're deployed to, and I need this firewall rule set enabling. Well, actually, by virtue of them using virtual WAN, it's very easy to enable that and deploy that across the infrastructure. So if anything, I actually think it probably would make life easier because it's quick. As you make those requests, they can be actioned very, very quickly and easily.
Okay. And so, yeah, since there is nothing that will change in terms of how the traffic is protected from the outside in or from the inside out, my application gateway will stay the same. So for example, if I have some resources, let's say if I'm operating here at this spoke at this region, which is not the main one, and let's say, for example, I'm going to add some resources for my application. I have, for example, here a function app or an AKS cluster, for example. Let's say, or function app. Let's take a Linux function app, for example. So with all its components that are available here and all the traffic that will be operating here, and maybe I need also, let's say, private endpoints. And in this case, my private endpoints will be within a subnet. So if I take this is like a real case application where I have in this, I have the subnet and private, I will add the private endpoint inside. And this private endpoint will be for my storage, let's say, storage account. So this private endpoint, I want it to be connected to the storage account. Of course, we'll talk about the IAC and the configuration in Terraform and so on. And let's say like I'm putting myself as an engineer working on this specific and this specific environment, specific region, and maybe this is a different subscription.
Yep.
In case I want to access some information that are in the main region, let's say we have some files that we need to pull from there, or whatever the function app needs to process and store the data because of whatever reason, redundancy and
Yep.
so on. How does it work at the network level?
So broadly speaking, exactly as it would do if you deployed hub and spoke, with the only change being that the routing is automated for you in virtual WAN. So virtual WAN manages those route tables. So if you added an additional VNet in as a spoke, that route would be propagated throughout the topology. You would not have to go in and manually add those routing tables, those route tables, updates to those route tables, sorry. So for example, if you had a storage account that was connected to that subnet through private connectivity, it would become part of that topology. And again, if you had a service, so let's say you put something like a VM running IIS or something like that, and you wanted to provide a website, perhaps to end users, you needed to publish that outbound, you could still do that using the normal methods that you would choose. So you might put a public IP on the Azure firewall and use a NAT rule or something like that. You may look to deploy a gateway or something like front door inside that VNet and integrate it. It doesn't, this is the really nice thing about virtual WAN, it doesn't block you from doing any of the normal things that you would be used to in any other topology. So your example would still function as you would expect.
Okay. And when you mentioned if I add a VNet here, so I still need to connect it to the hub, and as long as, like, when I connect it to the hub, everything is automated for me, right?
Correct. Yep.
Okay, I see.
And that would be the same. So for example, if you built out this topology and then you added another VNet as a spoke in your other site, that route would be updated and propagated throughout as well, and the communication
Okay.
would be enabled. So it's, again, for
You
that
mean here?
growth. Yeah, so that growth aspect is covered very nicely by having virtual WAN. If you have lots of planned changes, lots of planned growth across multiple regions, again, it's going to give you that benefit of the rapid growth and scale options.
Yeah, this is like, that's why I asked the question, is to be able to see when I scale the network, scale the topologies, because usually it's not one VNet within a region. If I have multiple teams, and even the same team may use different VNets and so on, how does it connect automatically to each other?
Yeah, exactly that. And even using this topology as an example, if you added another region in, because you wanted to deploy a particular service, perhaps something you were going to have a team working on a specific service or doing a specific function, actually by bringing that into the virtual WAN topology, everything within that topology could be accessed from that region. Again, that automated routing would take care of that for you. But also, yeah, just to call out from a security perspective, you still would retain the control of that through services like Azure Firewall or through a third-party NVA. I know the sort of the automated routing sometimes and all of the spokes being able to communicate to some people is wow, this is absolutely brilliant. To others, that would cause a big security nightmare. So it's just important to call out that you still retain the control of that.
Yeah, and usually, who are the teams that create the teams that create and manage the V1 and hub and spoke? Like, is it platform engineers? Does the security also contribute? Like, what's the delimitation? Yeah.
It's an interesting one, because I think that's something that varies massively depending on the organization and how the organization is structured. So in some smaller organizations, it's one team looking after all of the infrastructure, be it network, be it hosting, be it storage, and security as well. In other organizations, each one of those might be a particular individual. In a very large organization, each one of those might be a very large team. So sometimes, yeah, that's kind of a sliding scale as to the size of the organization and what they need. But what's really nice is, obviously, with all of the permissions in Azure, the delegation becomes quite straightforward because it's an Azure resource. So you have that ability to grant only the access as required, as you would be used to with other resources. I think, just as a typical example, in an organization that has specific teams for different resources, I think probably the networking or security team is probably the most likely to be looking after that virtual WAN, particularly if you have sites connected into it that are communicating over it, because that team is then probably also responsible for that last mile connectivity as well, where they're looking after perhaps a VPN termination device or something that sits in an on-premises environment as well.
Okay, it makes a lot of sense. I see. Yeah, and when we were discussing as well, you mentioned like the IAC options. So we're talking about the different services, Azure services, and how like the architecture, topology, and so on. But the ultimate goal is also to have it in infrastructure as code, to be able to provision it, and
Definitely.
have like maybe disaster recovery for it and so on.
What
are the options for IAC?
So obviously, all of the usual options people would go down are available. You could deploy in Terraform, you could deploy in Bicep, you could deploy the resources in PowerShell, Bash, whatever whatever particular option you wanted. The majority of my experience with virtual WAN as IAC has been in Terraform. I've also found utilizing aspects like map variables, and utilizing some of the functions where Terraform can do CIDR range and CIDR subnet, do some of those calculations for you. I have a bit of a running joke when I talk to people. I like to be as lazy as possible. So the more I can get code and tooling to do for me, the better, really. But from an infrastructure as code perspective, I've never seen any issues deploying virtual WAN, using it, across multiple sites, bringing in additional services, and again, things like, I have a lab I occasionally deploy if I need to test something. I just use a map variable, and if that map variable has one region in it, it deploys to one region. If it has 10 in it, it deploys to 10. I can scale up and down very quickly and easily to do that. Obviously, as well, Brainboard, as you've been demonstrating, options to deploy there. So it's pretty much for whatever tooling you're using. You can use with Virtual WAN, and I think again that's really key, because what you don't want to do is adopt it and then have to change your processes. So it falls into all of the standard deployment options that you have in Azure. There's no change needed really from whatever you're using.
And are you using like some of the approved modules from Microsoft, like AVM modules in the V1?
Yeah, so for a lot of the deployments I work on, it really depends. It depends on requirements, but for each deployment I work on, it's a case of capturing requirements, understanding what's the best fit, whether that's something off the shelf, whether that's something customized, and really, to be honest, in my experience, I tend to find a mixture of all of them. There's not kind of a one size fits all, but that's that's just, I guess, based on my kind of experience.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. But yeah, this is the enterprise. The nature of the enterprise workload is there is no size fits all at all, because it depends on the team, the organization, the topology, complexity, and so on. And back to the topic about the security and the configurations as well. We had one of the topics is security and firewalls. So, like, if you help us understand, like, the big picture of how the security can be applied, and what are maybe the frustration that you used to see when you have security that is too restrictive versus I need access to the internet, and that's it.
So I think Virtual WAN is really good, again, standardizing your approach across different regions. And I think that's, to be able to scale effectively, standardization is really important in infrastructure. Otherwise, what you end up with is differences across the estate, and obviously those differences cause challenges when things go wrong, or you're trying to do things. You'll look at a deployment in region A, then try and repeat that in region B, and it's completely different, for example. So that standardization itself brings a lot of benefits. From a security standpoint, I see Azure Firewall deployed a lot in conjunction with Virtual WAN. The predominant reason for that is the ability to centrally manage those rule sets and to do it all in the same deployment code, the same deployment tooling that you've used for Virtual WAN. However, that always leads to an interesting point, in that a number of organizations looking at Virtual WAN as a deployment are looking at it because they want it to help bring their branch offices, their sites together, and utilize that topology for communication. So one of the questions that often raises is, can we bring our existing firewall solution that we have deployed in all of our sites, that we centrally manage with whatever product it may be, into this topology? What you don't want to do is recommend a solution and then actually you have a different firewall product on the edge or on sites as to what you have in your central environment. So sometimes there's a bit of a balance to be struck there, and there are a number of third-party vendors that have solutions you can deploy as NVAs into Virtual WAN. So in those scenarios, that tends to be the route that's taken.
Okay, I see. And I'm looking at the questions as well. Jafar asked a very good question about, he said, how about the latency, V1 versus hub and spoke? Is there like any difference?
I don't think you would see any difference. If there is, it would be minimal. I've not been aware of a processing overhead or anything like that. Yeah, not something I've really experienced.
Okay, yeah.
Be an interesting one to test if you had something with extreme like latency needs or something. But yeah, no, it's not really a challenge I've come across.
Yeah, usually you look at the latency when you have problems. So you don't. Yeah. It's not optimization that you think about from the beginning. It's really when you run into some issues. And usually, yeah, it starts with maybe the application team is complaining or someone is complaining on the other end that you need to investigate. Anything that we didn't talk about, Jake, in the V1 that needs to be mentioned?
I think it's one of the best things I can say about just sort of for people looking at this as a potential solution is just deploy it and try it. Spin up a basic SKU instance. I don't believe the costs are particularly high for that. Perhaps you've got a test subscription or MSDN or something like that you can try with. But actually just testing this and getting comfortable with it is probably going to be the best way to work out if it's the right fit for your organization. There's lots of example infrastructures out there. There's loads of resources to help, and I think just having that in place allows you to then proceed with confidence. I would also suggest definitely check out the migration guidance that Microsoft have, because that will put a lot of the questions about how we would go from hub and spoke to virtual WAN, would put your mind at ease about that and give you guidance on those specific scenarios.
Is there any specific challenge that companies need to really think about carefully?
I think from a deployment perspective, I would say it's just about making sure it's the right product for you.
Okay.
The virtual WAN aspect is designed to, give you all of this centralized, but also to give you that ability to communicate over Microsoft's global network. So if you're not going to utilize that, then there's a question about perhaps hub and spoke is more appropriate. And obviously that comes back to that cost overhead piece that I talked about earlier. I think also if you are looking at deployment, that testing is really important. And that take virtual WAN out of the equation, that's the same for any type of resource that we would deploy. But also having a suitable migration plan in place is going to be really key. Once you start running those items in parallel, so perhaps you have an existing hub and spoke and you look to deploy virtual WAN and start migrating to it, you don't want that to be a process that takes ages, because it's just going to add headache. Have the plan, execute the plan, undertake the migration.
And if I'm an engineer just starting now, I know that there are a lot of AI that makes my life easier, and I just vibe code the infrastructure. I don't think that we can vibe code the V1 and push it to production. Yeah, what could be the best path that helps me understand the foundation of the networking, to be able to really understand how the V1 works, how does it compare to the hub and spoke, and at least be able to get a good understanding of why I choose one over the other. So what could that be?
As with anything, to be honest, Microsoft Learn is always the starting point. Just good old reading through Microsoft Learn. We've all been there, and just kind of looking at the resources there. But also, I think if you do have the ability to run something, to spin something up in a lab or test environment, again, that's really useful. There's also lots of sample environments out there. You can go and look at different GitHub repos, different people's blogs. There's lots of people, like myself, that have examples that they've published, and just utilize all of those resources to sort of soak up as much information as you can, really. I'm always a big advocate that there's no substitute for getting hands-on, though, and really building something. Build it, break it, work out why you broke it, what went wrong. That kind of activity is really valuable, I think.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, this is the hard way to learn is really to break in things.
Definitely.
Yeah, especially for technical topics, you cannot just learn by theory. You need to get your hands dirty on it to understand.
And it's a good one. If for example you're trying to do some testing with virtual WAN, a good scenario to spin up would be spin up a couple of regions. Deploy that if you've got somewhere you can do that. Perhaps put a resource in the second region, and try having a tunnel from your local site, or perhaps your home environment. If you've got a particular piece of equipment, a router that enables you to put that tunnel in, try it. See if you can get end-to-end communication from your site through to that resource in the secondary site. Prove that communication across the topology, and then try it with hub and spoke, and just really get hands-on with the technology. That will give you the best understanding of it. And once you've done that, try it in code. It's kind of go through that kind of process of trying lots of different solutions and bringing different things into the mix.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you very much, Jake. That was a lot of information to digest, and also it makes it clear, at least at the architecture level and foundation level, that the V1 is another solution that we need to approach it with more testing and really trying to prove that it works in our environment. And so the hub and spoke is like I don't know if we can call it legacy. It's too sweet to call it legacy, but yeah, it's let's say is the parent that like to be able to migrate from. You really need to have a good understanding, and from the skills at the skills level. I guess there is no difference between like someone who is operating already the hub and spoke. There is no learning curve to be able to operate the V1, right?
No, I think it's more just convention naming, that sort of stuff. If you've done the research and you know that the virtual WAN is the right solution for your organization based on your needs, then I think actually if you're working on Azure networking, I don't think you would have a problem at all. You would actually find very quickly that you start looking around and think, oh, actually, this is quite familiar. I understand this, because there will be things, resources that you're used to working with, and you're seeing them in a slightly different place, perhaps in the portal that you're used to, but actually all of it will feel fairly familiar. That's certainly how it felt for me anyway.
All right. So thank you very much, Jake, for your time, for your insights. Is there anything like the last point that I want to share? Any advice?
Yeah. Thank you for having me. Just as much labbing and testing as you can do is always the best learning, I would say. Yep.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Jake. Enjoy the rest of the day. Yeah.
You too.
And for everyone else, enjoy the day or the evening. Goodbye.
Thank you.